History books will tell you, kings are crowned in castles of stone and gold. They lie. The most powerful alpha king in our history didn't choose his Luna at a royal ball. He found her in a blood-soaked mountain cave, her face horribly scarred, standing alone between his dying body and absolute slaughter. The northern territories of the Iron Ridge Pack were unforgiving on a good day. In the dead of winter, they were a graveyard. For Bridget, the freezing winds were preferable to the cruelty of her own kind. Bridget was an Omega, a rank that usually afforded a wolf protection and warmth at the center of the pack. But Bridget carried a mark that made her an untouchable. 6 years ago, during a brutal raid by border rogues, she had thrown herself in front of a pup. The rogues' claws had torn a deep, jagged canyon across the left side of her face, from her temple down to her jawbone. In the brutal, aesthetic-driven hierarchy of medieval werewolf society, a disfigured Omega was considered cursed, a bad omen from the moon goddess herself. Banished to a drafty, rotting cabin on the farthest edge of the settlement, Bridget survived by becoming invisible. She learned the mountains better than the pack's finest trackers. She knew which mosses stopped bleeding, which barks broke a fever, and where the deep, hidden caverns lay beneath the frost. It was the eve of the long night, the most severe blizzard of the decade, when the scent of copper and panic hit the frigid air. Bridget was 2 miles up the mountain, gathering deadwood near a hidden limestone cavern known only as the Weeping Mouth. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and the snow was already falling so thick she could barely see her own boots. But the smell of fresh blood was unmistakable. It didn't smell like a deer or an elk. It carried the heavy ozone and pine scent of dominant alphas. Clutching her woven basket of kindling, Bridget followed the crimson trail, staining the fresh snow. It led directly into the jaws of her hidden cave. She dropped her basket at the entrance, pulling a small bone-handled hunting knife from her thick fur cloak. What she saw inside made her drop the blade. 12 massive wolves were strewn across the rocky floor of the cavern. These were not ordinary pack wolves. They were colossal, easily the size of draft horses, with thick, heavily muscled builds that marked them as royal guard. And they were dying. Deep, jagged wounds marred their coats. Some had arrows protruding from their flanks, arrows fletched with the distinct crimson feathers of the high royal army. Treason. In the center of the gruesome pile lay a wolf larger than the rest. His coat was the color of a starless night, but the left side of his chest was matted with thick, frozen blood. A specialized crossbow bolt, tipped with a cruel, barbed silver head, was buried deep in his shoulder. His breathing was a wet, ragged rattle. By all laws of the realm, an Omega was forbidden from looking an alpha in the eye, let alone touching a foreign royal. If Bridget were caught, she would be executed on the spot. But Bridget didn't see royal warriors or terrifying alphas. She saw suffering, and she knew what it felt like to be left to die in the snow. "Goddess, help me," she whispered, her breath misting in the freezing air. She ran to the entrance and dragged her basket of wood inside, hurriedly stacking it to build a massive fire near the back of the cave, where the smoke would vent out through a natural chimney in the rock ceiling. As the flames roared to life, casting dancing orange shadows against the limestone walls, Bridget went to work. She started with the black wolf. He was the anchor. She could feel the other 11 wolves drawing their fading strength from his presence. If he died, the shock would kill the rest. Bridget fell to her knees beside him. His golden eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever and pain. Even dying, his gaze carried a crushing, dominant weight that made her omega instincts scream at her to submit, to press her neck to the dirt. Instead, she gently placed her scarred cheek against his massive snout. "I am going to pull it out," she murmured, her voice steady. "It will burn. You have to stay quiet, or the storm will not be the only thing hunting you." The giant beast let out a low, rumbling growl, but he did not snap at her. He rested his heavy chin on her lap. Bridget grasped the wooden shaft of the bolt. Taking a deep breath, she yanked. The black wolf's jaws clamped shut, a strangled whine escaping his throat as the barbed silver tore free. Blackened, poisoned blood gushed from the wound. Bridget immediately packed the gaping hole with a thick paste of chewed yarrow, dried sphagnum moss, and snow, binding it tightly with strips torn from her own woolen tunic. For the next 4 hours, the scarred Omega moved like a ghost through the cave. She stitched torn flanks with bone needles and sinew. She packed herbs into bite marks. She dragged the unconscious, 1,000-pound beasts closer to the fire, using every ounce of her meager strength. By midnight, her hands were stained red, her muscles were screaming, and the fire was dying down. But the real nightmare was only just beginning. Outside, the blizzard raged, howling like a chorus of damned souls. Inside, the temperature was plummeting. The wood Bridget had gathered was gone. The black wolf began to shiver violently, a deadly chill setting into his massive frame. The silver poison had compromised his core temperature. Shifting to human form would generate heat, but in his comatose state, his body was locked in its wolf form to protect his vital organs. Bridget stripped off her heavy outer cloak. Wearing nothing but her thin, blood-soaked undertunic, she lay down on the hard stone floor and curled herself directly against the black wolf's chest, pulling the heavy fur cloak over both of them. She pressed her scarred face into his thick neck, sharing every degree of her own body heat with the dying alpha. Around them, the other 11 wolves instinctively crawled closer, forming a massive, breathing barricade of fur around the Omega and their fallen leader. For a moment, there was peace in the eye of the storm. Then, Bridget's ears twitched. Over the howling wind, she heard the distinct crunch of heavy boots on snow and the harsh, guttural voices of men. "They went up the ridge. The blood trail leads this way." Bridget's blood ran cold. It was the hunters, the traitors who had ambushed the royal guard. She recognized the harsh, barking voice of Lord Gideon's lieutenant, a brutal beta named Kyle. Gideon had been planning a coup for months, and tonight, under the cover of the long night storm, he had clearly made his move against the crown. The black wolf beneath her tensed, a low, dangerous rumble vibrating in his chest. Even half dead, he was ready to fight. "No," Bridget whispered fiercely, gripping his scruff. "Stay down. You're in no condition. I will handle this." She carefully untangled herself from the protective circle of wolves. She grabbed a handful of pungent wild garlic and crushed pine needles, rubbing the mixture violently over the wolves' coats and around the entrance of the cave to mask their heavy iron scent. But it wouldn't be enough. The hunters had tracking hounds. They needed a distraction. Bridget picked up her hunting knife. Without hesitation, she drew the sharp blade across her own forearm. She bit back a scream as hot blood welled to the surface. Stepping out of the cave and into the blinding blizzard, Bridget let her blood drip onto the snow. She ran. She didn't run back toward her pack. She ran toward the Whispering Gorge, a treacherous, narrow pass that dropped off into a deadly ravine. She left a deliberate, heavy trail of her own blood and footprints. veering sharply away from the hidden cave. The wind whipped her thin tunic, the cold biting into her skin like 1,000 needles, but she kept moving. "Here! I have a scent! Fresh blood!" one of the hunters shouted through the darkness. Bridget reached the edge of the gorge. The drop was sheer, obscured by the swirling snow. She stood at the precipice, letting her blood pool on the icy rock. Then she took a heavy branch, snapped it loudly, and threw her bloody outer tunic down into the black abyss below. She scrambled up a towering pine tree just yards away, ignoring the agonizing pain in her sliced arm, and pressed herself flat against the icy bark, blending into the shadows. Moments later, Kael and 5 heavily armed men, leading massive, snarling hounds, burst through the tree line. "The trail ends here," Kael barked, peering over the edge of the cliff. He spotted the bloody tunic caught on a jagged rock far below. "The bastards went over the edge. In this storm, and with those wounds, they're dead. The king is dead." The word sent a shockwave through Bridget's chest. The king, the black wolf in the cave, wasn't just a royal guard. He was Kaelan Ashcroft, the alpha king of the 5 territories, the most feared, ruthless ruler their kind had seen in 3 centuries. And she, a scarred, banished Omega, was currently holding his life in her bare, freezing hands. "Return to Lord Gideon," Kael ordered, turning his back on the gorge. "Tell him the crown is his." Bridget waited in the freezing tree for an hour after the men left, her body going numb. Frostbite was setting into her fingers and toes. When she was absolutely sure they were gone, she climbed down, her movements sluggish and uncoordinated. By the time she stumbled back into the hidden cave, she was barely conscious. The bleeding in her arm had stopped, frozen over by the biting cold. She collapsed onto the floor of the cave. Instantly, a massive black shape was standing over her. The Alpha King had dragged himself up. His golden eyes, though still clouded with pain, were wide with frantic urgency. He nudged her freezing body with his massive snout, whining softly. When she didn't move, he carefully grasped the collar of her tunic in his teeth and dragged her into the center of the pack. The 12 wolves surrounded her, burying her in a mountain of heat and thick fur. As the darkness of unconsciousness pulled Bridget under, the last thing she felt was a warm, rough tongue gently licking the frozen blood from her wounded arm, and the protective heavy weight of the Alpha King resting his head securely over her heart. She closed her eyes, expecting to die. But when the first piercing rays of dawn broke through the storm, illuminating the quiet, frost-covered cave, Bridget did not wake up cold. She woke up enveloped in a heat so intense it felt like a furnace. She shifted, her eyes fluttering open. The heavy fur that had been pressing against her was gone. Instead, a thick, muscular arm was wrapped securely around her waist. Bridget gasped, her heart slamming against her ribs. She looked up. The black wolf was gone. In his place, holding her with a possessive, unbreakable grip, was a man. He was magnificent, with battle-scarred skin, broad shoulders, and dark hair that fell into his eyes. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from her lungs. They were pure, glowing gold. Kaelan Ashcroft, the Alpha King, was awake, and he was staring directly at her scarred face, not with disgust, but with a terrifying, absolute reverence. "You saved my men." Kaelan's voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated through her chest. He reached up, his large, calloused thumb gently tracing the jagged edge of her disfigured cheek. He didn't flinch. You bled for a king you did not know. Bridget tried to scramble backward, her Omega instincts finally kicking in, terrified of the sheer power rolling off him. Alpha, forgive me. I shouldn't have touched you. Kaelin's grip tightened, pulling her flush against his chest. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling her scent deeply, sending a shiver down her spine. You will never apologize for touching me, little wolf, he growled softly, his golden eyes flashing with a possessive fire that made the very air in the cave crackle. By the laws of the goddess and the blood you shed, this life is yours. He stood up, lifting her effortlessly in his arms as his 11 elite guards began to shift into their human forms around them, bowing their heads in unison. You walked into this cave an outcast, Kaelin declared, his voice echoing off the stone walls, sealing her fate forever. You will walk out as my Luna. The descent from the weeping mouth was a blur of surreal, terrifying grandeur for Bridget. She was not allowed to walk. Kaelin Ashcroft, the Alpha King, carried her against his chest as if she were made of spun glass, wrapped securely in his own heavy, black-furred royal cloak. Flanking them were the 12 elite guards, men built like mountains, their eyes scanning the snow-drenched pine forests for any lingering threats. Among the guards were Cedric, a towering warrior with a battle-axe strapped to his back, and Alistair, the king's fiercely loyal tracker. Every time Bridget tried to insist she could walk, Cedric would chuckle, a deep, rumbling sound. "Save your breath, little Luna," Cedric called out, his breath misting in the crisp morning air. "The king's wolf hasn't stopped purring since he woke up with you. If her paws touch the snow, sire, I think your chest might cave in." Kaelin shot his guard a warning glare, though the golden warmth in his eyes betrayed his amusement. He looked down at Bridget, his expression softening instantly. "My men are entirely too comfortable speaking out of turn," he murmured, his thumb gently stroking her unscarred cheek. "But he is right. You gave me your heat, Bridget. You gave me your blood. You will not freeze on this mountain while I draw breath." Bridget buried her face in the thick fur of his collar, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I am an Omega, sire," she whispered, the deeply ingrained hierarchy of her life warring with the intoxicating reality of his touch. "I am scarred. When the Iron Ridge Pack sees us, they will laugh at you. They will say the Alpha King has lost his mind, claiming a ruined thing." Kaelin stopped walking. The entire procession halted instantly. The sudden deafening silence of the frozen forest was heavy. "Look at me," Kaelin commanded. His voice was soft, but it carried the undeniable magnetic pull of an alpha's command. Bridget slowly lifted her gaze. "They will not laugh," Kaelin vowed, his golden eyes blazing with a fierce, possessive fury. "They will bow, and if they hesitate for even a fraction of a second, I will paint the walls of their great hall with their blood. You are no ruined thing, Bridget. You are the woman who held the line when the kingdom's greatest warriors fell. You are my mate." The word hit her like a physical blow. Mate. The moon goddess's ultimate design. It was a fairy tale told to pups, a myth that a scarred outcast had never dared to dream of. Yet the absolute certainty in the king's eyes left no room for doubt. 10 miles below, the stronghold of the Iron Ridge Pack was a beacon of false victory. The great hall was blazing with torches, the long wooden tables groaning under the weight of roasted boar, heavy stouts, and winter root vegetables. Lord Gideon, a man with sharp features and a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes, sat at the high table. Beside him was Alpha Reginald, the cruel leader of the Iron Ridge Pack, who had personally banished Bridget to the borderlands years ago. "A toast," Gideon announced, standing and raising a silver goblet overflowing with crimson wine. The raucous laughter of the pack quieted. "To the harshness of the long night, it takes the weak, but it clears the path for the strong. With the unfortunate disappearance of King Kaelin in the storm, the 5 territories require a steady hand. Tomorrow we march to the capital to restore order." "To Lord Gideon!" Alpha Reginald cheered, slamming his tankard on the table. "The true King of the North!" The hall erupted into cheers. Noble women in silk dresses gossiped excitedly, and warriors clanked their mugs together, completely unaware of the storm that was about to break down their doors. Boom! The massive iron-reinforced oak doors of the great hall shuddered violently. The laughter died in an instant. Crack! The heavy timber splintered. Before Gideon could even bark an order to his sentries, the doors burst inward with explosive force, tearing off their iron hinges and crashing onto the stone floor. A biting, freezing wind swept into the warm hall, extinguishing half the torches in a single gust. Standing in the archway, silhouetted against the blinding white snow, were 13 figures. Panic rippled through the room. The scent of raw, unadulterated, dominant power flooded the hall, so thick and oppressive that several lower-ranking wolves immediately dropped to their knees, clutching their throats. "Goddess preserve us," Alpha Reginald whispered, all the color draining from his face as he recognized the massive, dark-haired figure stepping over the splintered doors. Kaelin Ashcroft strode into the hall, his golden eyes sweeping over the frozen crowd like a scythe. Behind him, his 12 elite guards fanned out, drawing their broadswords in perfect unison. The deadly ring of steel echoed in the cavernous room. "I leave my kingdom for one night." Kaelin's voice was dangerously quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the hall. "And I find rats feasting at my table." Gideon's wine goblet slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the stone floor. "Sire," he stammered, his mind racing to salvage the catastrophic failure of his ambush. We feared the worst. My Lieutenant Kyle found a blood trail leading into the Whispering Gorge. We thought you were dead." "I was," Kaelin replied coldly. He stepped aside, gently pulling the figure he held tightly against his side into the light of the remaining torches. The hall gasped in collective, horrified shock. Bridget stood beside the king. She was no longer wearing her bloody, threadbare tunic. Kaelin had draped her in a magnificent, fur-lined cloak of royal black and silver. Her silver-blonde hair cascaded over her shoulders, framing the stark, jagged scar that slashed across her left cheek. "Is that the outcast?" whispered Beatrice, a high-ranking female who had once thrown stones at Bridget in the market. "The marked Omega?" Alpha Reginald's jaw fell open. He stepped forward, his confusion overriding his terror. "Sire, with all due respect, what is the meaning of this? That is Bridget. She is a banished Omega. She carries a cursed mark. She is not fit to stand in your presence, let alone wear the royal colors." A low, terrifying growl rumbled from Kaelin's chest. It was a sound that promised absolute carnage. Cedric and Alistair tightened their grips on their weapons, waiting for the command to slaughter. But before Kaelin could unleash his wrath, Bridget placed a gentle, steadying hand on his armored forearm. The king froze. His murderous intent vanished, his body instantly relaxing at her touch. The sheer display of power, an Omega calming a raging Alpha King with a single touch, sent a shock wave of awe through the onlookers. Bridget stepped forward. She was trembling inside, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm, but the heat radiating from Caelan's presence behind her gave her a courage she never knew she possessed. "I may be an outcast, Alpha Reginald." Bridget's voice, usually a whisper, rang out clear and steady. "But I know the woods better than any tracker in your pack, and I know what Lord Gideon's men left in the snow." Lord Gideon's eyes darted nervously toward the exit. "The girl is mad," he spat, attempting to muster a tone of aristocratic disdain. "Sire, she is a low-born Omega with a diseased mind. Remove her from this hall immediately." "Let her speak," Caelan commanded, crossing his arms over his broad chest, his golden eyes locked onto Gideon like a predator watching a trapped rabbit. Bridget reached into the folds of her royal cloak. From a leather pouch at her belt, she pulled out a blood-stained, barbed silver crossbow bolt. The crowd gasped as the metallic scent of poisoned blood hit the air. "This was pulled from the king's chest last night," Bridget stated, holding the deadly weapon up for all to see. "The shaft is carved from weeping willow, a wood too light for common hunting, but perfect for silent, close-range assassination." "But it's the poison that betrays you, Lord Gideon." Gideon swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. "Poisons? I am a lord of the realm, not a witch." "No, you are a fool," Bridget countered, her confidence growing with every word. She turned to the crowd. "The poison on this blade is a mixture of refined wolfsbane and northern frostroot. Frostroot does not grow in the wild this far south. It requires a climate-controlled glasshouse. A glasshouse like the one Lord Gideon built at his estate 3 months ago." Murmurs of shock and outrage began to ripple through the pack. The evidence was damning. "Furthermore," Bridget continued, her eyes finding the brutal face of Kyle, Gideon's lieutenant, who was slowly backing away toward the kitchen corridors. "I was in the trees at the Whispering Gorge when your men tracked us. I threw my own bloody tunic over the cliff to throw your hounds off the scent. I heard you tell your men to inform Gideon that the crown was his." "Lies," Kyle roared, drawing his hunting blade and lunging forward in a desperate, suicidal panic. He aimed directly for Bridget, hoping to silence the only witness. He didn't make it 2 steps. Caelan moved with blinding, terrifying speed. He didn't shift into his wolf form. He didn't need to. He intercepted Cale mid-lunge, his massive hand wrapping around the lieutenant's throat, lifting the struggling beta off the ground as easily as a rag doll. "You hunted my mate," Caelan whispered, the sound devoid of all mercy. "You bled my Luna." With a sickening snap, Caelan broke the lieutenant's neck and let the lifeless body drop to the stone floor. Absolute silence fell over the great hall. Gideon fell to his knees, openly weeping now. "Mercy, my king. I was manipulated. It was a momentary lapse of judgment." Caelan drew the heavy, rune-inscribed broadsword from his hip. "There is no mercy for treason," he declared. He brought the heavy blade down in a swift, merciless arc. Lord Gideon's head rolled across the floor, coming to a stop at Alpha Reginald's boots. Reginald collapsed onto his hands and knees, pressing his forehead against the cold stone, trembling violently. "My king, I did not know. I swear on my wolf, I had no part in this assassination." Caelan stepped over Gideon's body, standing above the groveling alpha of the Iron Ridge pack. "You may not have plotted to kill me, Reginald, but you allowed a treasure to rot in the freezing cold. You looked at a wolf who sacrificed her own face to save a pup, and you called her cursed. You banished her to die." Caelan looked back at Bridget. "Her fate is in your hands, Luna. Say the word, and I will sever his head just as I did Gideon's." Bridget looked down at Reginald. The man who had caused her years of starvation, isolation, and misery was now a trembling, pathetic creature at her feet. She could feel the dark thrill of vengeance whispering in her mind. It would be so easy to nod her head. Instead, she took a deep breath. "I am not a killer," Bridget said, her voice echoing with a quiet, undeniable authority. "I am a healer. Killing you will not erase the years I spent in the cold." She looked up at Kalen, her eyes meeting his golden gaze. "Strip him of his alpha status. Banish him to the cabin on the borderlands. Let him learn how to survive the long night without the warmth of a pack. Let him feel what I felt." A murmur of profound respect rippled through the gathered wolves. It was a punishment far worse than a quick death. It was poetic, brutal justice. Kalen's lips curled into a proud, devastatingly handsome smile. "It is done." He turned to face the hundreds of wolves, staring at them in stunned silence. "Hear me!" Kalen's voice boomed, radiating the full, earth-shaking power of the Alpha King. "The era of vanity and cruelty in this kingdom ends today. You look at her scar and see a flaw. I look at it and see a warrior who stood between death and your king. Bridget of the Iron Ridge is no longer an outcast. She is my fated mate, my savior, and your undisputed Luna." As one, the 12 elite royal guards dropped to a single knee, bowing their heads deeply to Bridget. Slowly, the rest of the hall followed. Noble women, seasoned warriors, elders and pups, all fell to their knees, baring their necks in the ultimate display of submission to the scarred Omega who had just conquered the kingdom. Kalen stepped close to Bridget, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her flush against him. The scent of pine, ozone, and unyielding devotion enveloped her. He cupped her face, his thumb tracing the jagged scar one last time before leaning down and pressing a tender, reverent kiss directly onto the marred skin. "Long live the Queen," Kalen whispered against her cheek, as the roaring cheers of the pack finally echoed into the dawn. Did Bridget's journey from a scarred, banished outcast to the most powerful Luna in history give you chills? True strength isn't about a flawless appearance. It's about the courage you show when the world leaves you to die in the cold. If you loved this dramatic tale of betrayal, survival, and fated mates, hit that like button, share this story with your pack, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling werewolf lore and epic romance. See you next time.